Well, good morning, friends. I want to welcome you to the inaugural symposium of the Peter R. Hallock Institute. Before we begin, the Peter R. Hallock Institute, a shared ministry of the Compline Choir, St. Mark's Cathedral, Seattle, and the Episcopal Diocese of Olympia, acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of the Duwamish tribe. I am Jason Anderson, Director of the Peter R. Hallock Institute and also Director of the Compline Choir. I bring you greetings from the Very Reverend Stephen Thomason, Dean and Rector of St. Mark's Cathedral, and offer a warm welcome from the Right Reverend Gregory Rickel, Bishop of Olympia. The Hallock Institute furthers the legacy of the music of Peter Hallock and ensures that his music is widely known by cultivating and engaging potential partners and stakeholders and creating a broad network of musicians, liturgists, and clergy who champion Hallock's music. The Institute makes Hallock's music readily available in reliable editions and encourages its performance and recording, and it ensures the future of the Compline Choir by celebrating and sharing with others its core values, practices, and principles. So, now that we're here, 70 years ago this very month, or more precisely on October 28th, 1951, Peter Hallock began his tenure as organist choirmaster at St. Mark's Cathedral, Seattle. So how is it that so many decades later, people like you and me are gathered here in 2021 amid a global pandemic to talk about this man, his music, and his many contributions to the church? So let me start by asking you two questions, and you might want to pull up the Q&A here in Zoom to get involved here. What brings you here this weekend? What brings you here this weekend? And what do you hope to glean from our time together? Just pop your answers here in the Q&A if you don't mind. Looking for more literature by Peter. Good. Well, as things pop up here as we continue on, feel free to use the Q&A throughout the presentation here. Supporting the work of the Hallock Institute, getting to know things you didn't know about Peter before. We'll hopefully get some of these answered here. So keep on popping your questions in here, and we will address them as best as we can. So when considering Peter Hallock's gifts to the church, we are presented with an impressive oeuvre. A 40-year tenure as organist choirmaster at St. Mark's, the creation of the chant study group that became the Compline Choir, a group Peter directed for 53 years, the installation of the tracker action organ by Dirk Flintrop, the composition of the Ionian Psalter, a collection of psalms for the 3-year lectionary cycle, and approximately 225 musical and theatrical works, both sacred and secular. In addition, he introduced countless audiences to the countertenor voice, produced liturgical dramas and composed liturgical dramas, both for the Cathedral and Church Divinity School of the Pacific. He recaptured liturgy as drama as manifest in Advent and Good Friday processions at the Cathedral, and he co-founded a publishing company, Ionian Arts, together with Carl and Catherine Crozier. And finally, he was the first to produce a historically informed performance of Handel's Messiah. Before we journey onward, I feel like I should share a little bit about Peter's early biography because it helps explain some of his development into the towering figure that we remember him for. He was born on November 19th, 1924, the youngest of 5 children, raised in Kent, Washington. And from an early age, he had been fascinated with sounds and also theater in the form of puppetry. You can see a photo of Peter with one of his puppets. Not sure exactly the age in the photo there. The first recording he remembers, about age 2, was The Three Kittens, which we're going to hear more about shortly. He began piano at age 5, and he began attending St. James Episcopal Church in Kent, not because the family was Episcopalian, but because the church was the closest to the family home, and because to get to that church you didn't have to cross over railroad tracks in Kent. Serendipity at play there. At age 9, he visited St. Mark's Cathedral for the first time. Bear in mind that in 1933, the concrete of the Holy Box had only been poured 5 years earlier. It was a new space. At age 14, he began playing organ at St. James in Kent and also commenced organ lessons. And he describes his life as rather Currier and Ives. And I'm going to play a little audio sample here of this Three Little Kittens episode because I think you'll enjoy it.
I'll tell you about my first phonograph. The date would be about 1926. I was 2 years old, and I received a phonograph as a Christmas present with one record. And so I will ask my sister Barbara now to stand and tell us all what she remembers about my 2-year-old phonograph that I got as a Christmas present.
The 3 little kittens have lost their mittens and to cry. Oh, mother dear, we fear, our mittens we have lost. What, lost your kittens, you naughty kittens? Then you shall have no pie. Oh, mother dear, we greatly fear. Our mittens we have found. Oh, found your mittens, you dear little kittens, then you shall have some pie. Meow, meow, meow. And we heard this over and
So you get a little glimpse of Peter in his early age playing this recording over and over and over again, so many times that even late in life, his sister Barbara could sing the song back. So we move forward to the UW years, the University of Washington. Peter enrolled in the University of Washington School of Music, but was drafted after the first year of study. There you see a photo of Peter when he was stationed in Honolulu. He served in the Pacific as a chaplain and sharpshooter. How the two of these go together, I'm not quite sure. And Peter really didn't like talking about that particular time. After the war, he returned to the UW, completed his undergraduate studies, but he still had 18 months of paid education thanks to the GI Bill. So in 1949, he enrolled in the Royal School of Church Music at the College of St. Nicholas, which then was quartered at Canterbury Cathedral. And here, he drank deeply from the well of Anglican liturgy and music, studying liturgical and musical forms, and happened upon a recital of Elizabethan music given in the chapter house by none other than Alfred Deller. That recital changed Peter's life and ours, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Peter sang in the cathedral choir also, but as part of his studies at the Royal School of Church Music, his daily coursework combined singing in a choir comprised of boys from the city of Canterbury and those enrolled in the college, which included only men and only one American, that being Peter Hallick. And when the time came for part assignments in the choir, Peter had sat in the baritone section, but he didn't stay there for long, which we'll cover in just a little bit here. When GI Bill funding was coming to an end, Gerald Knight, director of music at Canterbury Cathedral, found a way to appoint Peter as a lay clerk. And in an audition that followed evensong in the choir with the Red Dean, as Peter referred to him, Hewlett Johnson, Hallock's appointment was sealed. Officially, he was known as a choral scholar, but he functioned as a lay clerk, the first American to do so. And you can see in the precentor's books at Canterbury Cathedral, Peter Hallock's mention on all those services that he sang at. While at the RSCM, another life-changing event occurred in the crypt when Peter and his classmates chanted Compline there. And they used the order of service that's not so dissimilar from that which the Compline Choir in Seattle uses today. You can see Peter Hallick in the Canterbury Cathedral Choir here on the left side there. Peter completed his coursework, left Canterbury in September 1951. 1 month later, he began at St. Mark's. And when he began there, resources available to him included the 1902 Kimball organ, which predated the cathedral by a quarter century, and what he described as a geriatric choir numbering 13 persons. Given the conditions of the organ, Hallick set about building a choir that could sing unaccompanied, and by 1956 the choir had grown to 40 persons, 10 of whom were university students paid to sing in the choir. From this point onward, the biography becomes indistinguishable from the innovations and accomplishments. And before I continue in the keynote, I want to diverge for a moment and speak about Rudolf Otto and the idea of the holy, and then about Peter as mystic and composer. You need to put your theologian hat on for a moment here. This could get a little bit heady. But this phrase, God is in the numinous. God is in the numinous. Peter insisted it be engraved on his memorial plaque, and that should tell us something. Numinous, from the Latin numen, means divinity. And Otto wrote that the holy, or the numinous, is both rational and non-rational. Rational and non-rational, but is preeminently a non-rational object, something entirely free of human reason and limitations. Free of human reason and limitations. The holy, as Otto wrote, is something one cannot define. It must be experienced. Integral to the numinous are the mysterious, the tremendous, the fascinating, and the august. The mysterious, or mysterium, is an experience which breaks forth from the depths of the life of feeling as the feeling of the transcendent and as a result of external stimulations and occasions. Or in other words, our mind reacts to an experience with such shock and awe that we are left in absolute amazement. The tremendous, tremendum, is an experience of an object that generates boundless awe and wonder in the one who experiences it. The fascinating, or fascinans, is an experience of something that captivates and transports with a strange ravishment, often rising to the point of dizzy intoxication. These are Otto's translated words here. The august, or augustum, is an experience recognized as an objective value in itself. An experience recognized as an objective value in itself, which we claim as valued in our own. Together, mysterium tremendum fascinans et augustum, we have a form of mysticism here. And mysticism, according to Otto, is a religious experience itself, with the non-rational numinous elements predominant. Non-rational numinous elements predominant. I'm going to play a short excerpt from Peter's work, Michael, Archangel of the King of Kings, with the Bird Ensemble and Mark David Obenza directing. And I want you to be listening for what mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, or august techniques or bits you hear in this music. Peter Hallick, mystic and composer. As we've heard, Peter's early affection for music is well documented thanks to his sister's singing of the Three Little Kittens for us. But from an early age, his imagination was stimulated in such a way as to propel him into a life filled with creating, composing, and exploring in sound. And this naturally spilled over into other collaborative endeavors, such as the liturgical dramas. He collaborated with Ronald Arnott, Aurora Valentinetti, Glenn White, Clifford Berkey, and others. Puppetry, as you saw earlier in the photo, first with his Aunt Edna and Uncle Charles, and then again with Aurora Valentinetti. Liturgy as theater, primarily in the O Antiphon service at St. Mark's, which he developed with William Bertolus and others. And then multi-channel surround sound and compositions utilizing pre-recorded sound with the audio geniuses Glenn White and Bill Levy. Brass and percussion on major feast days, Dutch handbells from Pettit and Fritzen, the Flintrop tracker action organ, the droves of gifted musicians and instrumentalists that called St. Mark's home. All of these unique, strange, and wonderful people and things became part of a color palette from which Peter could paint when creating and composing. And when Peter combined that palette with a stunning text, usually by another mystic or a metaphysical poet, he revealed his true prowess as a composer and often ripped open for the listener the music of the spheres. Peter wrote in one of his legendary email epistles to me, "Since I've been a singer since I was 5 years old and seldom ever an instrumentalist, I hear music the way singers hear music, as an expressive accoutrement to language, and the communication of ideas through language, storytelling, as the raison d'être. As I imagine the way language works, there is always present, or should be, and that may be the catch, an anticipation, a feeling of movement towards the point in the sentence when the word or words finally culminate in the realization of an idea. Therefore, form in vocal music is the result of kinesis, anticipation in action, leading to stasis when the point is realized. This is my credo. It's a different world view from one most of us were taught about rhythm or form in music." End quote. Peter notoriously worked on a piece of music up until the deadline, and the speed and rapidity with which he revised works made cataloging them exceptionally difficult. And I once asked Peter why he had such a propensity for revision. His reply, quote, "When I hear a piece of mine on a recording, I then have the wonderful opportunity to view it from a distance. If at any moment a feeling of inevitability is interrupted, I consider that moment in time to be a flaw that needs to be corrected. In a sentence, revisions are the result of perceived flaws in the successful handling of the time dimension." End quote. I take this to mean that Peter's revisions were due to him hearing the holy being undone, the numinous being undone by something neither rational nor non-rational, the irrational. In 2010, Peter presented new recordings of The Last Judgment and Te Deum Laudamus in Thompson Memorial Chapel at St. Mark's in an event titled "A Celebration of Recording as an Art Form, St. Mark's Cathedral, 1968 to 2010. This event marked a turning point in Peter's creativity and allowed him to take on a new cognomen, audio iconographer or sound writer. Peter wrote in prepared remarks for that event, quote, "Entering the world of images is through the doorway of altered states of consciousness, requiring an approach characteristic of all forms of meditation, a quiet and peaceful time, and a place set aside from the stress-inducing stimulation of daily life. The recordings presented here represent an as yet unexplored art form to which I have given the name audio iconography." End quote. In September 2013, Peter asked me to author a portion of liner notes for a second surround sound recording of Hail, Universal Lord, and I wrote, Hail, Universal Lord begins with poetry from John Milton's epic Paradise Lost in the expert hands of mystic and composer Peter Hallick. Poetry, the language of the soul, is the preferred language of choice for mystics. When poetry like Milton's is in the intuitive care of a mystic and composer like Hallick, the combined opus allows the listener to experience both poetry and music in a new, varied, and unified way. This builds for the listener new avenues toward greater comprehension, understanding, emotion, and feeling, in essence, inscribing the opus on both mind and heart. I think it's Peter's ability to inscribe poetry and music on both mind and heart that serves as my best understanding of what an audio iconographer does. And this also sparked my interest in and love for Peter's music. And yes, I do believe there is an identifiable Hallock signature sound that one picks up on almost immediately when listening to his music. I'm going to share with you a short excerpt from Exultate Deo, recorded by Choral Arts Northwest with Richard Sparks conducting. You certainly can hear moments of kinesis and stasis in that. And that's such a varied color palette used there in that particular orchestration. So now we come to the big accomplishments of Peter Hallick. And a personal privilege for me, I have to list the Compline Choir as probably Peter's greatest gift, in that the choir led to a resurgence in Compline. So a bit about Compline Choir itself. You remember that experience Peter had in Canterbury in the crypt. He must have experienced something divine or numinous in that time. It made an impression on him. Sometime in 1954, we're really not sure about a date, Peter hand-typed out personalized invitations to 12 men from the University of Washington School of Music and the community to explore Gregorian chant. And it's that chant study group that coalesced and became eventually the Compline Choir. Why did they chant Compline? Two reasons. It's what Peter had done at Canterbury and is what he brought back with him from the Royal School of Church Music. And second, it provided an opportunity for those in the chant study group to practice their art form in a liturgy. First, just to themselves in an empty cathedral, then to their spouses and close friends, and then to the world. The first radio broadcasts began in 1962, but attendance didn't begin to skyrocket until 1967. You can thank your hippie or flower children parents or grandparents for that explosive growth. A little diversion here. Liturgists, rectors, priests take note. This liturgy began publicly in 1956. Didn't take off till 1967. So it developed on its own over the course of 11 years before it became a success. So trying something for 4 weeks or 12 weeks as an experimental liturgy maybe isn't the best course of action. Maybe you just need to let it breathe a little bit and see what happens. So what drew all these droves of people from 1967 onwards to this day to come to Compline? Peter mused on it in an article entitled The It of Compline, which he wrote for the Cathedral's newsletter. The it of Compline is many things. I think of it as a multi-dimensional experience consisting of a kind of harmonious, interdependent relationship between many elements and factors, a system in which the presence of the parts is critical and essential to the whole. Thus, the office of Compline, the particular form of the service, the words said and sung, does not by itself tell us what it is. It is space, physical, acoustic, psychological space. It is people, the large gathering of folks who are engaged in the business of getting to know God, or the numinous. It is a mystic experience, which we've heard a little bit about courtesy of Rudolf Otto. It's the choir itself, of course, and it is what it needs to be. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Hallick here. Quote, "The Compline service may find its best definition not in terms of what it is, but what it does. For the needs it fulfills, for those who attend in person, the large radio audience, and members of the choir. For all of these, it is part of the journey towards God. Such a journey must allow for definitions as varied as its sojourners, with the promise of a goal as wide as sky and sea." End quote. The Seattle Compline Choir is a progenitor of scores of other choirs and services devoted to Compline across the church, across denominations, and across the globe. It is also perhaps one of the reasons for inclusion of Compline or night prayer in prayer books published in the latter half of the 20th century. From within the Seattle Compline Choir, which was a playground for Peter Hallick as composer, he wrote dozens of pieces and 51 psalm settings for men's voices. Other budding composers and church musicians had opportunity to workshop their music. Among them, Richard Prue, Rupen Shakarian, Jeff Junkin-Smith, Bruce Neswick, and Kevin Siegfried. And also now, for current composer in residence Aaron Oss and myself. And because of the choir's focus on anthems and music drawn primarily from the Renaissance, several early music specialists come from within this tradition, including Dana Marsh, Doug Fullington, and Mark David Obenza. So where's Compline now? We're back chanting Compline, as we have been, and we've also sought to provide opportunities for women to chant the office. And when the choir took pilgrimage to England in 2019, after consulting with the dean, I asked Rebecca Gilmore to lead an all-female choir in her absence. Those services were exceptionally well attended and were the first Compline services from St. Mark's to be live-streamed. The opening piece sung by the women was an arrangement of Down at the River with its entreaty, "Oh, sisters, come on down." So may it be. We're still trying to figure out what's going on here with this, but we are in agreement about this principle, that however Compline is offered at St. Mark's, it will be offered by men or women separately, not together, sort of in the monastic tradition. And I would be, if I didn't mention this, I'd regret it. The pandemic did the pandemic did not silence Compline. In fact, even though we were dwindling from 24 down to 2 persons at the height of the pandemic, we made sure that the office was recited every Sunday in the Compline Corner at St. Mark's. It's just that important to those in the choir and also to the prayer life of the cathedral. Praying shapes believing. It also shapes behavior. And so we took every precaution. We followed all health guidance, and even now we're reassembled into the full choir. We sing masked. So I'm going to play a short little excerpt from Jubilemus Omnes by Peter Hallick from the Compline Choir's recording, What Hand Divine I'm conducting here. If you like all of it, this little taste of it, you can hear all of it at Compline tomorrow night. So the photo I should have mentioned is of Compline in the crypt at Canterbury Cathedral in 2019 when we were spending a week in residence there, finding our roots, so to speak. I will come to the Flintrops shortly, but I did want to include just the fact that Peter was a countertenor. So back to Canterbury, if you had asked Peter Hallick in 1949 who sings alto in a cathedral choir in England, he would have answered older boys. He quickly learned that this was not the case, and you remember that concert by Alfred Deller that I mentioned earlier. Listening to him sing, Peter mused that hearing a man sing in a woman's range required an adjustment, but also that the adjustment was momentary. Peter was deeply moved by Deller's beauty and artistry, so deeply moved that when Edward Wright, the RSCM choirmaster, needed to replace 2 altos, he asked for volunteers. The man to Peter's left stood up and moved from baritone to alto, and Peter followed him into the alto section. And Peter mused that I made the move to the other end of the bench, and on a spring day in May 1949 began as a countertenor in an English choir. And after being installed as a choral scholar, lay clerk in the cathedral choir, Peter recalled, the year in the cathedral choir was the most valuable hands-on learning experience of my then 20-some years as a student of music. Truly a baptism by fire. And later, Peter wrote, as I reflect on that second day in Canterbury, hearing Alfred Deller sing, I realize that at the time it was a matter of intuition that I understood that the countertenor voice, with its shamanesque, gender-neutral sound, was the ideal instrument for the near metaphysical, inner life poetry of Dowland, Campion, and others. Peter concertized in England before returning, first at Bede College at Durham in 1950. And in the United States, he concertized from Seattle to California to Alabama to Wisconsin and all points in between. I want to do a quick interrupt here and commend a book to those of you who might be interested in males singing the alto part. The book is titled The Supernatural Voice, A History of High Male Singing by Simon Ravens. And if you are under the impression that men have always sung alto in English cathedral choirs, you'd be wrong, and this book can really illuminate you there. I'm going to play a short excerpt from the Songs of the Nuns of Chester. You'll hear Peter Hallick singing the solos together with the trebles from the cathedral choir. Now we come to what Peter considered his greatest accomplishment at St. Mark's, the mighty Flintrop. This project began as an ultimatum, Peter laying down this ultimatum that if a new organ were not installed at St. Mark's, he was going to leave. The cathedral didn't want him to leave. In fact, they wanted him to stay. And after consulting with Power Biggs and others, Biggs and Hallick and Loeffler, the dean at the time, and the vestry agreed that installing a tracker action organ built by the Dutch firm D.A. Flintrop was the best course of action. In 1965, this was ridiculed, or 1960s when this decision was being contemplated. This was ridiculed by church musicians, clergymen across the Episcopal Church. Why would you install an anachronistic organ in an Episcopal cathedral? There had never been an instrument, a mechanical action instrument of this type installed in an Episcopal cathedral, let alone any cathedral in the Anglican Communion. Also, part of the design, Peter insisted that the new organ and the choir be located together in the rear of the cathedral, not in the front. Again, this is not the norm for Episcopal or Anglican cathedrals. Another concern that people expressed was that this would have been, at the time, the largest instrument that Dirk Flintrop would have built. Most of his organs up to that point had only been 15 stops or less. The St. Mark's organ design called for 55 stops. Of course, the firm Flintrop has built considerably larger instruments since. Despite all this hostility, the vestry and dean gave the go-ahead with a target installation of spring 1965. The organ itself cost $110,000, and structural additional changes required by siting the organ and the choir in the rear, costing $175,000. In today's dollars, that would equate roughly to $3 million, but in actuality, if we had to redo it all again, it would be in excess of $5.5 million. A short little, I had never heard Dirk Flintrop's voice before. Roger Sherman shared a recording of this. And so this is a little 2-minute excerpt of Roger Sherman speaking with Dirk Flintrop.
I remember I was in Cambridge and had a phone call from Peter Hallock asking me if he could come and see the Harvard organ.
While you were still in the States?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So did he fly out from Seattle then and meet you? And
then he invited me to come to Seattle.
Yes.
And there I met, what's her first name, Valentinetti.
Aurora Valentinetti.
Aurora,
That's
yeah.
right.
Sorry, I forgot her name.
No, that's fine. And so you came to Seattle and you saw St. Mark's
Yeah.
Cathedral and the potential for a good organ there. And then you came back with a proposal. You came back with two proposals, is that right?
Yeah, one based on a 16 and the other one on a 32.
Right. And
And decision was made for the 32.
yes, there's a funny story about that. Did you know this?
No.
That the vestry met to try to decide which of the two organs to build, the big one or the small one.
Yeah.
And after the discussion, there was a long moment of silence, and then the dean said, "Well, we don't have the money for either. We might as well go for the big one." And that's how they came to choose the larger of your two proposals. It had nothing to do with the fact whether or not they had the money.
By the way, the dean then was a very nice and friendly man.
Yes, Dean Leffler. John
Yeah.
Leffler was a wonderful man.
Wonderful man.
Yeah.
And I remember when we came there for the dedication, my wife and I, when we left Seattle, he said goodbye to us, and he said, "Dick, Marianne, God be with you," which just a
Mm-hmm.
normal say to sing for a minister in any
Yeah.
way. But the way he said this went right through you. There was, I still remember the sound of his voice, the way of his saying.
It meant something.
Yeah, that really meant something. One thing I want to add, that I have met very, very nice people in Seattle,
Mhm.
and please will you give my greetings to all of them. Maybe they are listening to this broadcast. but
Yes.
My very best to all of them.
Well,
Just a few photos of the Flintrop arriving at the port in Seattle and then being installed in the cathedral nave here that you're looking at. Concurrently, between the time the contract with Flintrop was signed and the organ installed, Hallick took a 6-month sabbatical leave to study with Fenner Douglas at Oberlin and traveled to Holland to see the organ being built. Structural work began in mid-1964 and finished later in that year, and installation of the organ began soon thereafter. Peter did indeed consider the installation of the Flintrop one of his greatest accomplishments. And certainly installation of this instrument at St. Mark's opened up new options for other churches and cathedrals. If you want to go deeper with the impact of the Flintrop's installation at St. Mark's, I commend to you Roger Sherman's PDF, The Flintrop Organ of St. Mark's, which you can download from the cathedral's website, or you can email us and I'm happy to send it to you. You've heard several bits of the organ in the various recordings here. I want to play just a short little excerpt of the chorale improvisation on the Victime Pascali by Charles Tournemire with Mel Butler playing. This was at the Burial Rite for Peter Hallick, recorded on May 14, 2014. It's an incredibly versatile instrument. You can play Buxtehude and Bach on it. You can play from the French school, and you can accompany English cathedral anthems on it. Lots about that in Roger Sherman's PDF that I mentioned. And then taken together, another of Peter's many gifts here, were the processions and the liturgical dramas. These were crucibles in which Peter Hallick, composer and liturgist, and I would add dramatist, could test and try new music, new sounds, new ways of moving people in the cathedral, new ways to engage with the numinous. They were also provided a different avenue for people to cross the threshold at St. Mark's and encounter God or the numinous or something spiritual without the trappings of Sunday morning services or sermons. The church is not just for preaching and worship services. There were the Advent and Good Friday processions, liturgical dramas like Britten's Noye's Flood and Hallock's own Everyman and Days of Herod. These were all massive, collaborative, creative efforts involving many visionaries and creative types, just like Peter. And all of these productions utilized the entire creative palette available. Costumes, banners, puppets, handbells, instruments, singers, lighting, audio, all of it, all of it. The key here is that there was a collaborative effort. The Advent procession is still going on strong, and particularly now that it's in the form of O Antiphons as the framework. And liturgical dramas have made a resurgence of sorts, mainly through the pageant of the Nativity, with Rebecca Gilmore and James Savage and Michael Kleinschmidt doing some wonderful things with that. But also the play of Daniel just before the pandemic, in collaboration with Boston Camerata and Early Music Seattle. The signature piece from the Advent procession, which many of you know, would be Let My Prayer Come Up, and I would commend that to you. Also of note would be the Ionian Psalter and the Compline Psalter. These are two mammoth collection of psalm settings. The Ionian Psalter, which I mentioned before, is a 3-year cycle of psalms for the lectionary, Sunday morning lectionary. And it exists simply because the dean at the time, Cabby Tennis, insisted that the psalms be sung with greater congregational participation. And this gave Peter an impetus for composing something new. So beginning in October 1981, again, another anniversary to celebrate here this month, happy 40th birthday to the Ionian Psalter, the settings in those psalms are beautiful, and they provide opportunities for choristers to improve their sight reading skills and encourage congregations to engage with singing the psalms. The future of the Psalter is uncertain. There are several holes, courtesy adoption of the Revised Common Lectionary, particularly those of you on track 1 in the season after Pentecost. And there's also the problem of the text as set from the 1979 prayer book. The Psalter is quite masculine in its conception of the divine. And with Peter gone, who knows what will happen with this. I will mention that if you partake in the Ionian Psalter, you are granted permission to adapt it for local use, meaning you could change the text to be something more inclusive or set different verses that are needed for the new lectionary. I know this is time consuming. I've done it. Michael Kleinschmidt has done it. It's very time consuming. Last year, we published a collection of Peter's psalm settings for the Compline Choir. This is monumental in that you're able to see in Peter's compositional output as a total, as a whole. And you can discern thematic unity across some of the psalms, common compositional devices. In short, the genius of Hallick is revealed. I'll also mention briefly Peter's first historically informed performance of Messiah in Seattle. He didn't consider himself part of the historically informed performance practice group. He just liked it because, for pragmatic reasons, it was easier to balance singers and instruments, and he believed that the Baroque bow achieved better articulation and resulted in clarity of the musical rhetoric. The first hip historically informed performance of Messiah was in 1985, and it continued up until Peter's departure from the Cathedral in 1991, and it did continue for several years after Peter's departure but the last Messiah performance produced by St. Mark's was in 2002. So that's all well and good, but what are we to take away from all of this? So I've sort of identified 5 key things that I want to drive home at the close of the keynote here. The first has to be that God is in the numinous. God is in the numinous. So to this end, how do we as organists, choir masters, liturgists, clergy persons, how do we provide glimpses of the divine? What paves the way to experience the numinous, and what detours us from the path? And for me, as I ponder my future in church music and liturgy, I've come to believe that everything matters, from the architecture of the building, to the textiles, to the banners, to the sounds that you're going to hear in the space, to the words that you hear spoken, be it scripture or preaching, to the printed program. It all sort of matters in that each of these elements either will enhance or detract, or harmonize or be discordant with the numinous. The second is kairos, or playing in God's time. I don't want to muse on this too long, but I do believe that the pandemic has sort of depleted our ability to process things in kairos, or God's time. We are very aware of the length of this Zoom webinar, and we are timing things now to fit within a preset live stream length. And our ability to focus, better yet, to be fully present when hearing or making music, engaging in worship and liturgy, even enjoying a meal or praying, it's all been diminished by our pandemic experience because we've been made so aware of chronological time. So the sooner we let go of chronological and latch on to God's time, the sooner we can glimpse the divine and find our center. These mountaintop experiences creep up throughout Peter's life. Had Peter not gone to England to study at the RSCM, we wouldn't have the rich musical legacy at St. Mark's that we have today. If Peter hadn't launched the chant study group, we wouldn't have the Compline choir, etc., etc., etc. And so moving forward, one of the reasons for the 2019 England pilgrimage was to provide for current Compline choir members a mountaintop experience. And thank God we had that to latch on to help sort of fuel us and get us through 18 months of drudgery during the pandemic. Fourth is the impetus to collaborate with other visionaries and creative persons. It took dozens and dozens of creative types working together and collaborating with Peter to present some of these larger processions, liturgical dramas, concerts throughout his career at St. Mark's. And finally, I mentioned this rich and varied palette that Peter cultivated at St. Mark's. And this palette was what allowed him to orchestrate interesting things into pieces of music. When's the last time you heard a celeste be part of an anthem on Sunday morning? I mean, this is very unique, very, very unique in output here. Yes, some of the colors in this palette were exceptionally costly. The flintrop, the handbells, and hiring 6 brass players plus 2 or 3 percussionists on Sunday mornings. This is costly. But taken together, they form a marvelous palette from which Peter could draw on his own spirituality, his own sort of ethos in his composing process. So those are my 5 key takeaways, hopefully, for you from this particular keynote. Questions and answers time. If you're still awake over there on the other side of this Zoom webinar, I'd be delighted to answer some of your questions. And John had asked the question about how did Peter's spirituality affect his music. I don't think you can divorce spirituality from the music itself. I think Peter often said that the music was already inherent in the text. And so if the text and the music taken together, form this sort of unified spiritual experience. And I hope I've addressed some of that, John, and can consider. Are there other questions? I'd welcome you to drop them in chat here. You've all been very attentive and captive, I think. It's hard to tell, you being on the other end of the internet here. Michael Kleinschmidt, yes. I will share my story of first coming into contact with Peter. It was a legendary 3-martini lunch in Issaquah, Washington. I had approached Peter via email about cataloging his works as a part of my doctoral work at the University of Washington. And that request was met with a warm invitation to share lunch together. And it was a fateful day in 2004 when we had our lunch together. And it's the rest of they say is history. And John is asking, how did Peter rejuvenate his own spirituality? How did Peter rejuvenate his own spirituality? I think it's in the ancillary parts of his life that I didn't really get to talk about today, whether it would be the discipline of keeping a formal Japanese garden, which he had, or trimming the wisteria from his front entry there, to weaving at the loom. He was a prolific weaver. We're still finding little bits and bobs of him, things that he had woven together. I think having lunches and talking about the creative process and the experience of music, experiencing his music, hearing his music revised with other colleagues was very helpful to rejuvenating his own spirituality. Time off always helps. Peter was an avid reader, voracious reader, books upon books upon books, most of them to do with psychology and spirituality, particularly the writings of Thomas Merton being prime among them. And I'm pleased to say that 6 of Peter's Merton books are now in my own library here at my home. And he wrote and wrote and wrote, wrote and wrote and wrote. So I hope that helps a little bit, John. Greg is asking, summarize Peter's feelings about the 79 prayer book. Well, I think, so the late 60s, early 70s were a period of great play in what was happening in Episcopal worship. And I think Peter perceived sort of this inevitability of moving towards a time when the printed book wouldn't take primacy. We were entering a period of flexibility in verbiage and music in Episcopal worship. And so that's why you have some interesting pieces that we'll read through at the choral reading session tomorrow afternoon in Songs for Liturgy. But I think it's always problematic, prayer book revisions, because it changes authorized texts. And authorized texts are usually set to music. And so there's the need to go back and revise to bring it up to snuff, so to speak. I don't think Peter minded the adoption of the 1979 prayer book. I think it just meant a lot of work for him because he had built up, up until that time, a great wealth of repertoire that he would have to go back and revise or leave behind. So I hope that answers Greg. Other questions? Seeing none, I hope to see many of you at the panel discussion. Oh, Ken, you're asking about the writings about music. There's lots of writings, and I will tell you, they're in spiral-bound notebooks at the Diocese of Olympia archives, and Hallock Institute board member Joel Matter is currently digitizing these writings. There's a lot of writings, as you might imagine. There's probably some 20-odd spiral-bound notebooks that Joel is trying to work through on that. So there's lots of writing. So our keynote is concluded, and I'm going to pull the question and answer to a close here. And thank you again for attending. You can reach me via email at director@hallickinstitute.org. I'll drop it in chat here in case you want to email me. I'm always happy to get folks singing Peter's music. There's my email address in the chat for you all. I would welcome some correspondence. Our panel discussion starts in an hour and a half, just under an hour and a half here at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you all for joining us, and I will see you at the panel discussion. Have a wonderful day.